I heard an enormous splash outside my back porch one morning and rushed out, half asleep, expecting maybe a clumsy raccoon or a flailing fish. What I actually found was enough to stop me cold: a brand new iron fence stretched across the strip of land leading to my dock. It stood tall, black, and imposing, with a sign blaring, "Private HOA access only, trespassers will be prosecuted." As if that weren't insulting enough, a security camera perched atop it, blinking red like a smug robot I fixed on me. For years, I'd woken up at dawn to fish and sip coffee by the lake, but suddenly, this fence cut me off from my own shoreline. No warning, no courtesy knock, no explanation. I had no idea who put it there or how they believed they had the right. Turns out, the story behind this fence and the woman responsible, HOA Karen, was more twisted than I could have guessed. And believe me, I wasn't about to let my peaceful retirement go down without a fight. Hey everyone, before I jump even deeper into this story, which gets wilder by the minute, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Could you drop a quick comment letting me know your city or town? I always find it amazing how stories can bring folks together from all over. Also, if you're enjoying this first-hand account of HOA madness, I'd be honored if you'd gently tap that like button and consider subscribing. I promise, I'm not here to push you around or bark orders, just a friendly request from a guy who appreciates good company. Hearing from you keeps me motivated to share these tales, so I truly appreciate any support you feel inclined to offer. Alright, now that we've got that little housekeeping out of the way, let's roll up our sleeves and dive back into the drama. Trust me, if you think it was outrageous for a fence to appear on my property overnight, that's only the tip of the iceberg. That evening, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that fence tall, dark, and audaciously planted on what should have been my path to the lake. By sunrise, I had replayed every possible move in my head: call a lawyer, write a stern letter, rally the neighbors, or maybe just tear the fence down with my own two hands. But I'm not exactly in my prime shape anymore. The last thing I needed was a legal claim against me for destruction of property, especially since the sign threatened prosecution for trespassing. Never mind what they'd do if I tried to damage their precious fence. My first real attempt to resolve things came when I decided to walk the perimeter, check property markers, and talk with the folks who'd been around longer than me. My neighbor, Dave, had lived in the area for over 20 years. He said that a small slice of land near my dock used to belong to an old bait shop owner who passed away. That land was separate from my deed, technically, though we'd all assumed it was so tiny and worthless that nobody would bother messing with it. Apparently, the HOA saw it differently. They had quietly purchased that skinny strip of lakeside land and slapped their rules on it. Dave told me he was sorry for my troubles, but the rumor mill said HOA Karen was unstoppable. She'd done similar power plays throughout the neighborhood, though never anything quite this brazen. After hearing that, I felt the sting of dread. Maybe I really was stuck. Part of me wanted to test the fence in a more direct way, so I grabbed a pair of bolt cutters I kept in my shed, walked down to the gate, and tried to wedge them into one of the links. I barely got the cutters in place before I heard a car rolling up. Out stepped Karen, this time with a self-appointed security guard wearing a windbreaker that read HOA Patrol. I didn't know whether to laugh or get angry. Before I could do either, Karen whipped out her phone and threatened to call the sheriff if I didn't leave HOA property immediately. Something in her triumphant smirk told me she'd already called them. Sure enough, within the hour, a sheriff's deputy arrived. He was polite, asked a lot of questions, and seemed genuinely confused that a private resident like me would suddenly be walled off from his own dock. However, after checking the updated property maps and verifying who held the deed to that narrow strip, he concluded that, at least for the moment, the fence was legally on HOA land. I had no right to cut it. No arrests were made, but I got a pointed warning to avoid taking matters into my own hands. Meanwhile, Karen stood off to the side, arms folded, wearing a smug grin that broadcasted just how delighted she was with the entire showdown. That night, I paced my living room floor until my knees felt weak. It was humiliating being told I couldn't even step on the footpath to my own dock. If this fiasco kept up, I might as well have been a stranger looking at my boat from behind bars. The fence had effectively severed me from a chunk of the lake I'd enjoyed for years. And that camera perched on top, it never stopped blinking. I felt like it was watching me stew in my own helplessness. I'm a reasonable man, so I decided that if a confrontation with bolt cutters was off the table, maybe I could talk sense into The HOA board. Some neighbors mentioned they had public meetings, though I wasn't a member, so I'd have no official voting power. Still, I figured it couldn't hurt to show up, present my case, and see if there was a shred of empathy or, at least, understanding. With that plan in mind, I dressed in my Sunday best a collared shirt and jeans without holes, grabbed a folder containing my original property documents, and headed to the next HOA meeting. The meeting was held in a small community center not far from the lake. It was your typical neighborhood affair: cheap coffee in styrofoam cups, a folding table for the board members, and a handful of residents sitting around on metal chairs. Karen was, of course, at the front, seated like a queen on a throne. The rest of the board included a quiet older gentleman, a middle-aged couple who kept whispering to each other, and a younger woman named Stephanie, who was taking notes with a focused expression. When the agenda reached open comments, I cleared my throat and stood. I introduced myself and explained my situation, how I had lived by Cattail Lake for years, believed the path and dock to be part of my access, and discovered only recently that some small overlooked parcel had transferred to the HOA. I understand. You have your rules, I said, trying to remain calm, but this fence effectively traps me out of my own dock. I'm hoping we can find a solution that works for everyone. Karen wasted no time jumping in. Unfortunately, you're not an official member of the HOA, she said, giving me that same condescending smile I'd come to resent. And the fence is a legally approved structure to ensure safety and limit liability for the association. If you'd like access, you're welcome to apply for membership under our guidelines. She proceeded to outline how that would involve monthly fees, compliance with all sorts of regulations, and worst of all, no guarantee they'd even let me keep my dock as it was. The older gentleman on the board blinked uncertainly, like he might be sympathetic, but didn't want to challenge Karen publicly. The middle-aged couple avoided eye contact, clearly not wanting to ruffle any feathers. But Stephanie, the note-taker, frowned, her brow furrowing. She asked Karen, "Are we sure we followed all the required steps to notify adjacent property owners about this purchase and the fence installation?" Karen waved a hand dismissively. "We followed standard procedure," she insisted. "It's all in the records." That was the end of that. I felt my blood boil. But what could I do? This entire system was set up to keep people like me non-members on the outside, literally. The meeting ended with no resolution, just a bunch of pitying looks from some neighbors and one more patronizing smile from Karen. I spent the next few days sulking, flipping through my property paperwork and contemplating whether to hire a lawyer to sort this out. Lawyers cost money though, often more than a retired plumbing engineer can comfortably spare. Just when I was about to give up, I saw something that made my jaw drop: a faded "for sale" sign half buried near the gravel road on the opposite side of that fence strip. It looked like it had been there for ages, the paint peeling and the contact info barely legible. But it got me thinking, could there be another piece of land adjacent to this trouble spot that the HOA didn't scoop up? I jotted down the phone number, though it was so faded, I had to guess the last 2 digits. When I called, I reached a real estate agent who sounded surprised anyone was asking about that parcel. She explained that the lot in question was indeed part of the old bait shop property. Apparently, it had been subdivided into 2 narrow slivers. The HOA had leased or bought one sliver, but the other was still in limbo, owned by some older lady who inherited it from a distant relative and had never even set foot there. The agent said, "If you're interested, I'm sure the owner would entertain a reasonable offer." My heart pounded. If I could buy that second sliver, maybe. It included the actual post holes or a chunk of the fence. And if the fence was installed partly on that sliver, then legally, the HOA would have no right to block me out. At worst, it would give me some leverage to negotiate. At best, I'd own the land that physically held up the fence effectively. Flipping the script on HOA Karen, within a week, I'd done enough research to confirm my hunch. The HOA had purchased or leased only one half of that skinny lakeside strip. The other half was indeed up for sale. The agent's eyes practically lit up when I said I'd like to make an offer. Clearly, they'd had zero interest in that weird leftover parcel. The price was shockingly low. Apparently, folks didn't see much value in a narrow piece of land that didn't have direct road access or room for a building. For me, it was a dream come true. I signed the paperwork, transferred the funds, and just like that, I owned the exact patch of dirt under a critical section of the fence. The best part, the fence's gateposts were firmly planted in that patch, meaning the HOA had inadvertently anchored their pricey iron gate in ground that now belonged to me. Talk about poetic justice. I kept my purchase quiet at first, biding my time. Word around the lake was that the annual Cattail Shores HOA Summer Barbecue was coming up, and they planned to host it in the very spot behind that fence my old dock area, treating it like their own private lakeside retreat. I decided that would be the perfect moment to let Karen and her entourage know exactly what had happened. On the morning of the barbecue, a handful of HOA members showed up early with tables, chairs, and a big cooler of refreshments. I watched them from my porch, sipping coffee, as they set everything up. They even brought a portable speaker to play some music and a fancy banner reading, "Welcome to the Cattail Shores Summer Gathering." Meanwhile, that hulking fence stood there like a proud sentinel, dividing me from my dock. Right when Karen arrived, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and her usual air of authority, I decided it was time for action. I'd already swapped out the hose lock for my own the night before an operation that felt downright thrilling. I replaced their padlock with a brand new one I bought from the hardware store, making sure to secure it tight. Then I taped up a fresh sign, "Private Property Access. By owner permission only." Karen marched up to the fence, probably expecting to glide in with her original key. When the key wouldn't fit, she jiggled it, pulled harder, tried another key, then jiggled some more. Confusion spread across her face. She fiddled with that lock for a good minute, her expression darkening with each failed attempt. The small crowd that had gathered to enjoy the barbecue started exchanging puzzled looks. Finally, Karen stepped back, took out her phone, and called for someone named Bill to come help. Bill tried the lock as well, no success. That's when I strolled up, as casual as a man could be, the new deed clutched in my hand. Karen's eyes darted to me, brimming with frustration and embarrassment. "Could you please explain what's going on with this lock?" she snapped. "Oh, this," I said, gesturing to the padlock. "I just replaced the old one. See, I'm the new owner of this part of the property. Your fence is on my land, so I'm afraid your key won't work anymore." I handed her a copy of the deed, neatly highlighted to show the exact portion I now owned. Her face shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to a shade of red I'd only seen on cartoon thermometers. "This must be some kind of mistake," she spluttered. "You can't just buy community property." I shrugged. "I didn't buy community property. I purchased the adjacent strip that was still private. Turns out you folks only leased or purchased half the land you needed for your fence. Now I own the other half, the half with the actual gateposts." The crowd behind her started murmuring, and a few stifled chuckles drifted through the air. One of the board members, a younger woman, came forward and asked to see the deed. Her eyes widened as she confirmed it was legit. Karen spun around, clearly flustered, and announced there had been a clerical error that would be addressed promptly. But people weren't convinced. A couple of neighbors even applauded quietly. Nobody likes a bully, and it seemed Karen's veneer of control was cracking. Once the deed was out in the open, Karen didn't have much ground to stand on. The hose fence, so proudly installed, was partly on land they didn't own or control. If they tried to remove it now, they'd be destroying my property. If they tried to keep it locked, well, I had the only key. I could let them in or not, at my discretion. Legally, it put them in a bind. Over the next week, I filed official notices with the county just to protect myself. I wanted to be sure nobody from the HOA could tamper with my newly acquired land or the fence without risking a trespassing charge. I also installed a motion-activated floodlight on my side. Every time someone approached the fence from the HOA side at night, it would click on and illuminate them in bright light. It wasn't there to record them. I just wanted them to know. I was watching, ironically flipping the dynamic they'd forced on me with their own camera. Meanwhile, I kept the fence in place, but changed the signage to read, "Private Property, Access by Owner Permission Only." I like the irony of turning their so-called barrier into my personal boundary marker. Karen responded predictably. First came a sharply worded letter accusing me of hurting community morale. Then she tried a legal threat, claiming I was unlawfully restricting HOA access. My lawyer, yes, I ended up consulting one, eventually sent back a simple letter referencing the property lines and included a copy of the deed. That shut down the threat pretty fast. Around this time, I learned the HOA board had started to fracture. Some of them were outraged that Karen had spent association funds on a fence installed on land they didn't fully own. Others were embarrassed by the fiasco and thought about stepping down. Stephanie, the note-taker, visited me one afternoon, apologizing for what happened. She said Karen had bulldozed her way through the fence project, ignoring protocols that would normally require verifying property lines thoroughly. She also hinted that some financial records looked questionable, like Karen had diverted funds for safety measures that might not have been approved. Suddenly, all the bravado Karen had flaunted began to crumble. She tried filing a complaint with local zoning authorities, claiming I was erecting barriers that violated some obscure code. That backfired when the inspector came out, took one look at the updated records, and told Karen she had no standing to challenge anything on my property. Feeling cornered, Karen attempted one more dramatic play. She hired a locksmith to replace my padlock with another one, presumably an HOA-approved lock. The locksmith came by when I wasn't home, but a friendly neighbor tipped me off. I drove back just in time to catch him in the act. I rolled down my window, waved the deed, and calmly explained I owned the land. The poor locksmith turned red, apologized, refused to tamper with private property without my consent, and left in a hurry. Score another point for me. Rumors swirled that Karen was losing her grip on the HOA. Some board members were calling for a vote of no confidence. Others wanted a full financial audit to see how much money she'd burned on this fence fiasco and other questionable projects. HOA members who'd once been afraid to speak up against her started whispering about cleaning house. I overheard a neighbor say, "She's gone too far this time," while loading groceries into his trunk. It gave me hope that justice might prevail for everyone who'd been bulldozed by her, but Karen was not the type to go down quietly. She took her battle online, filming ranty videos with her smartphone, claiming I was an entitled non-member who stole community land. She'd pace back and forth, calling me all sorts of names: lake hog, greedy retiree, even fence goblin. She posted these videos on a local Facebook group, but folks quickly saw through her one-sided story. People who lived by the lake chimed in to set the record straight, pointing out that the HOA had no rightful claim to the entire parcel in the first place. Some were fed up with Karen's constant meddling in everyone's business, from telling them what color they could paint their shutters to how many cars they could park in their own driveways. It wasn't long before a few tech-savvy neighbors made memes out of her video clips. One showed Karen pointing angrily at the fence, captioned, "When the bully can't control the gate." Another had me leaning against the fence with sunglasses, labeled Gatekeeper of Cattail Lake. I have to admit, it felt strangely vindicating. The more Karen tried to demonize me online, the more people rallied around me simply because they couldn't stand her pushy, entitled attitude. Within a month, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Many of them had had enough. Stephanie told me afterward that Karen tried every last trick in the book to maintain her position, from citing obscure bylaw clauses to accusing board members of misconduct. But ultimately, she was suspended pending an investigation into her misuse of funds for the fence project. Realizing she might be forced out anyway, Karen resigned. In her resignation letter, she blamed everyone else. She called the board toxic, the neighbors ungrateful, and the entire fiasco a witch hunt. Nobody bought it. When the dust finally settled, the new board took a more measured approach. They rewrote some of the rules to prevent future land grab shenanigans. They also apologized to me and a few other neighbors who had faced arbitrary HOA crackdowns. I decided to keep the fence up, but as a reminder of what happens when power-tripping individuals think they can steamroll over others, I changed the sign to something a little more welcoming for neighbors who respect property boundaries. Friendly access granted. Just knock first, and you know what happened. People actually knocked on my door, asked politely if they could fish off the dock, and I happily said yes. All it took was a little courtesy. You'd think that would be the end of it, but there was one final twist. A few months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, I was enjoying the last rays of daylight by the water when I heard a car engine. Out stepped Karen, looking far less confident than before. She didn't have her clipboard or her wedges. She wore simple jeans and a hoodie, sunglasses over her eyes as if she were trying to hide. She walked up to the fence, which was wide open, by the way, and just stared at it for a while. I didn't say anything at first, deciding to give her space. Eventually, she noticed me and managed a small, awkward nod. "Still got the key, I see," she said, not in her usual condescending tone, but rather quietly. I lifted my thermos in a half salute. "Haven't needed it in a while," I replied. She didn't apologize or offer any explanation for her previous behavior, but she also didn't launch into a tirade. After another moment of uncomfortable silence, she turned and walked back to her car. I watched her drive away, and that was the last time I ever saw HOA Karen in person. Word around town was that Karen relocated to another state shortly after, where she tried forming some kind of HOA accountability group. Whether she was genuinely trying to right her past wrongs or just looking for a new audience for her drama, I couldn't say. What I can say is that Cattail Lake felt more peaceful without her constant interference. The new HOA board focused on projects that actually benefited the community, cleaning up the shore, organizing a monthly yard sale, and setting up better trash receptacles. People seemed happier, friendlier. Even folks who'd been on the fence, no pun intended about me, ended up waving hello when we crossed paths. The biggest shocker for me was how many neighbors thanked me for standing up to Karen. A few told me stories of receiving petty violations for mailbox decorations or having late fees stacked up for minor infractions, and how they wished they could have done more to push back. In a weird way, my standoff with the fence had become a symbol of rebellion against overreaching authority, and it reminded me that sometimes all it takes is one determined person to shine a light on the nonsense. And so, there I was, still living in my modest cabin, still waking up early to fish off the dock, only now with the satisfying knowledge that I wasn't just a powerless retiree. I'd proven that even a single homeowner could hold their ground when someone tried to bulldoze their rights. Sure, it took some legal maneuvering and a bit of luck with the land sale, but it taught me a lesson: never assume you're out of options when someone tries to lock you out of what's rightfully yours. Thank you for sticking with me through this entire saga. If you enjoyed watching HOA Karen get a taste of her own medicine, I'd love it if you dropped a friendly gatekeeper wins in the comments. And if you want to stay in the loop for more first-person stories of ordinary folks standing up against nonsense, whether it's bullheaded neighbors, ridiculous rules, or just everyday life challenges, feel free to tap that subscribe button. Your support means a lot. Stay respectful out there, remember that a little kindness goes a long way, and never be afraid to stand your ground when push comes to shove. Until next time, take care and keep fishing for those moments of peace and justice wherever you can find them.